Okay, so today we're looking at completing the square. Okay, this is another method for solving quadratic equations. Before we can really get into complete the square, though, we have to look at some properties, such as the square root property, okay, because we're going to use this. So, if, helps if I can write, if b is a real number, okay, remember real numbers is pretty much anything except for non-repeating decimals, square roots, those kind of things. Okay, so if b is a real number and if a squared is equal to b, then a is equal to plus or minus b. Okay, a is equal to plus or minus b. So anytime I introduce the square root, I should always use that plus and minus, because we don't really know if this number is going to be squared or positive or negative. Okay, because once you squared, the negative would go away and both would create a positive answer. So it could be positive or it could be negative, and anytime you introduce a square root, so you put the square root in there, you have to include both of those. Okay, so if I just take the square root of a square, that would get rid of the square. Okay, and as long as I do the same thing to both sides, then it's still going to be equal. So all that says is, like here, x squared equals 25. Okay, so I can square root both sides. The square root of x squared is just x. Square root of 25 is 5. Since I put the square root in there, I have to include both plus and minus. Okay, so this means positive 5 would be an answer and negative 5 would be an answer. Okay, 5 squared is 25. Negative 5 times negative 5 is also positive 25. Okay, so I have two answers, plus 5 and minus 5. Same thing here, only have to isolate that variable first, because if I try to take the square root from here, well, the square root of 2 is a decimal. Okay, so I can't just do the square root over here, because then I'm going to have some weird decimal, and we don't want to do that. What I can do is divide by 2 first. X squared is equal to 7. Okay, now that I have x squared by itself, I can square root both sides. That gives me x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7. Okay, and since 7 isn't a perfect square, then we just leave it as the square root of 7. Okay, it's going to be some kind of decimal, but we want an exact answer, so we leave it the square root of 7. Same thing happens if you have something like this with an expression that is being squared. Okay, since I have the parentheses around here, then I can still square root both sides. Okay, because the square root of x plus 1 squared, and we did this when we did our radicals unit, when we looked at the square roots. The square root of something squared is just itself. Okay, and then I have the square root of 12 over here, so we're going to throw that plus or minus square root of 12. Okay, so now I have to finish solving, because I am still trying to solve for x, and I can't have a plus 1 there. Remember, solving means I'm going to have x equal something. So we're going to subtract that 1 over. So x is going to equal negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 12. Okay, if you remember back from radicals, remember I can break down 12, so we're going to do that. 12 breaks into 4 and 3. Okay, 4 breaks into 2 and 2, so we've got 2 square root of 3. So x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Okay, now a lot of people want to put this negative 1 and positive plus or minus 2 together here. Okay, but you can't really do that because we've got that square root of 3 tacked onto the end, so I'm just going to leave it like this. Still two answers, negative 1 plus 2 root of 3 and negative 1 minus 2 root of 3. Okay, so I still have two answers, but I'm just going to leave it like that. Okay, because they're not like radicals because I don't have a square root of 3 on that negative 1. Okay, so same sort of thing here. Left-hand side is squared, so we square root both sides. Gives me 2x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus square root of 16 is 4. Remember, if I have a negative underneath the radical, that comes out as an I. Okay, remember that's an imaginary number. We did those with complex numbers. Okay, so the square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of that negative is I. So I get plus or minus 4i. Again, finish solving for x. Add the 5 over. Okay, same thing, these are not like terms, so we're just going to leave it as 4 plus or minus, or 5 plus or minus 4i. Okay, since this has the I on it, I can't add it to the 4, you just leave it like that. Divide by 2. 5 plus or minus 4i all over 2. Again here, okay, we can't reduce 4 and 2 because I've got this plus or minus over here. This 5 is also being divided by 2, and 5 is not divisible by 2, so I can't reduce anything, so I just leave that as my final answer. 5 plus or minus 4i all over 2. Okay? There's a couple of your turns. I would suggest hitting the pause button, give them a try, make sure you can get the correct answer, and then come back on here and check them out. Okay? Since you can pause, I'm going to just keep on going. So if I take this one, okay, we first want to divide by 5. Again, if I take the square root right away, then that 5 gets stuck under the square root. We don't want to trap the 5 under the square root, so we're going to divide it over first. Since this is 5 times x squared, divide the 5. That gives me x squared equals 4. Okay, once I have x squared equals 4, now I can square root both sides. X is equal to plus or minus 2. Okay, make sure you have the plus or minus on there. It's incorrect without it. You have to have those two answers. Both of them would give me 20 here. Okay, same thing for b, square root both sides. I get x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus 3. Add the 3 over. Okay, you can't do plus or minus 6. A lot of people want to just add it here and do plus or minus 6, but one of these is positive and one of them is negative. So you're not going to get plus and minus 6. Okay, 3 plus or minus 3. Since these are actual numbers that we can add and subtract, we need to do that. Okay, so one answer is 3 plus 3, which is 6. Okay, so there's 1, and the other answer is 3 minus 3, which is 0. There's my two answers. So anytime you have actual real numbers that you can add together, okay, then you need to actually break that apart. When I say real numbers, really I mean integers. If you have integers that you can add together, okay, then you need to go ahead and do the split and find your two answers. Okay, but if it's something like this where you can't put them together, then you don't have to worry about splitting them apart and writing two separate answers. You can leave it with the plus or minus. Okay. So now let's remember, okay, so now we got to walk through this. So when we're factoring things, okay, remember if I have something like this, target product here would be 1, target sum would be 2, the two numbers that multiply to 1 but add to 2 would be 1 and 1. Since there's a 1 in front of x squared, that means I'm allowed to shortcut that, so I would get x plus 1 and x plus 1. Okay, this can be rewritten as x plus 1 squared. Okay? That's going to be rewritten as x plus 1 squared. Okay, so we were going to have quite a few of these. Okay, these are called perfect square trinomials. We've talked about these before. Okay, so perfect square trinomials. So for instance here, target product is 9. Target sum is negative 6. Okay, so the two numbers that multiply to 9 but add to negative 6 are negative 3 and negative 3. If my two factors are the exact same thing, then that's considered a perfect square trinomial, and we're going to use these. Okay, so here we would go x minus 3, which is x minus 3 squared. Okay, again, hit pause, try that last one there, that's your turn. I'm going to keep on going, so target product positive 4, target sum negative 4. Two numbers that multiply to 4 but add to negative 4 are negative 2 and negative 2. Perfect square trinomial. Again, we're going to use these. That's why we're looking at all of them as perfect square trinomials. Okay, so we get x minus 2, which is just x minus 2 squared. Okay, so now let's put those two skills together. Let's say I have something like this. Okay, here, now a lot of times when we're factoring, we would subtract the 25 over. Okay, but for this particular skill set, we're going to leave it like this because the left-hand side is a perfect square trinomial. Target product is 1, target sum is negative 2. The two numbers that multiply to 1 but add to negative 2 are negative 1 and negative 1. So that's x minus 1, which I can rewrite as x minus 1 squared. Okay, x minus 1 squared equals 25. Well, now this looks exactly like C in that very first section. Okay, so now I can use that square root property to solve. X minus 1 is equal to plus or minus 5. Add the 1 over. X is equal to 1 plus or minus 5. So x equals 1 plus 5, which is 6. X is equal to 1 minus 5, which is negative 4. So that would be my two answers there, 6 and negative 4. Okay, so same sort of thing here. This is a perfect square trinomial. Okay, target product is 4. Target sum is 4. Two numbers would be 2 and 2. Okay, so we've got x plus 2, which equals 9, which gives me x plus 2 squared, which equals 9. Square root both sides. we get x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 3. Subtract the 2 over, x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 3. Okay, split that apart. X is equal to negative 2 plus 3, which is 1. X is equal to negative 2 minus 3, which is negative 5. Okay, so try your hand at the last one there. Make sure you can do these. Okay, if you take this, target product is 9. Target sum is negative 6. Two numbers would be negative 3 and negative 3. So I've got x minus 3, x minus 3. Yes, you can skip this step, as we will when we get a little bit further on in here. So you can skip this and go straight to x minus 3 squared, which equals 16. Square root both sides. X minus 3 is equal to plus or minus 4. Do not forget that plus or minus. It's super important. It's how we get our two answers since it's a quadratic. So x is equal to 3 plus or minus 4. So we get 3 plus 4 is 7. And we get 3 minus 4, which is negative 1. Okay, 7 and negative 1. Oops, sorry, right off the page there. 7 and negative 1, and that would be your answers there. Okay, so now we're going to take those skills and we're going to do completing the square. So we're almost to solving by complete the square. So completing the square is a process where we create perfect square trinomials. Okay, so to complete the square, what you do is you have to take half of b and square it. So b is the number next to x. Okay, it's the coefficient of x. So you'd take that divided by 2, find that answer, and square it. So for instance here, okay, if my b value is 6, so I would take half of 6, which is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So I would add 9 in, and by adding in 9, that makes it a perfect square trinomial, so that when I factor it, I would get x plus 3 times x plus 3, or x plus 3 squared. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of those. So for instance here, okay, if I want to complete the square, I take half of b and square it. Okay, half of b is 1, 1 squared is just 1, so half of b squared is 1. And then if I factored this, okay, target product here would be 1, target sum would be 2, so my two numbers that multiply to 1 but add to 2 would be 1 and 1. So this thing would factor to x plus 1 times x plus 1, which is x plus 1 squared. Okay, something important to notice here is that it's always going to be half of b. Since we're taking half of b and squaring it to add it in to make the perfect square trinomial, when I factor it down, it will factor down to half of b and then that whole thing squared. So here, same thing. Negative 8 over 2 squared. Okay, negative 8 over 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 squared is 16. Okay, this number is always going to be positive because once I square a negative, I end up with a positive number. That's why we didn't even leave the option here for this. It's always positive. Okay, so the number you add in is always going to be positive, and that's important to know. Okay, so this would be x minus 8x plus 16. Now, if I factored that, which it didn't really ask you to do in the notes, but just so you know, if I factored this, it will factor down to x half of b squared. Okay, negative 4 times negative 4 makes positive 16. Negative 4 plus negative 4 makes negative 8. Target product, target sum. So, same thing's going to happen here. Now, this gets a little trickier because 5 doesn't really divide by 2. I mean, it does, but it's going to be a decimal. Okay, and we don't do decimals in this class, so you're going to have to leave it as a fraction, which is fine. 5 over 2 squared. Well, 5 squared is 25, and 2 squared is 4. So it's just 25/4. That's what would add to both sides. Now here's the better one. If I were to factor this, okay, so now if I try target product, target sum, that gets a little tricky. So this is where knowing the shortcuts help you. Okay, so if I'm going to factor this, it would factor down to x half of 5 is 5 halves. Okay, so x plus 5 halves squared. That's how this factors down, x plus 5 halves squared. Okay, so try that last one. So completing the square. Okay, again, hit pause, try it, see if you get the right answer. Okay, so half of b squared. So we take half of b and square it. Half of b is negative 5 squared is positive 25. So you're going to add that 25 in. That's completing the square. Again, if you were going to factor this, it will factor down to x minus 5 squared. Okay, because target product is 25. Target sum is negative 10. Two numbers that multiply to 25 but add to negative 10 are negative 5 and negative 5. So you get x minus 5 squared. Okay, so now that's completing the square. So now we need to put all of that together and actually solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. Okay, so start off with, if the coefficient of a is 1, go to step 2. Okay, if it's not 1, then you need to divide both sides of the equation by the a value. Okay, you have to have a 1 in front of x squared in order for this to work. That's why all of our examples we had a 1 in front of x squared. So if not, you're going to have to divide everything on both left and right hand side by a whatever number the a value is. So whatever number's in front of x squared. Okay, then you're going to get the variables alone on one side of the equation. Okay, and then complete the square. Okay, when you complete the square here, make sure you add to both sides. Okay, so when you take that half of b and square it, you can't just add it to the side with the x values. You have to also add it to the other side. And I'll show you some examples of that. So then you're going to factor the perfect square trinomial that you just created and write it as a square, and then use the square root property. Okay, so take the square root of each side. So we're going to put all of those skills that we just learned together into one process. So, very first thing says to look to make sure there's a 1 in front of x squared, which we have. Okay, then it says get all your variables alone on one side. So since this 6x is on the right hand side, we're going to move it over to join our x squared. So I've got x squared plus 6x. Now I'm going to leave a blank because this makes it easier for me, and I'm going to put 1 on both sides. Okay, so just like the last little things that we did right here, and we had our little blank, oops, if you can see it on the camera, there we go, and we had our little blanks so that we could fill in whatever would make it a perfect square trinomial. That's what we're going to do here. Okay, and whatever we do to one side of the equation, we have to do to the other side of the equation. Okay, so we're looking at doing b over 2 squared. So my b value is 6 over 2 squared. Okay, half of b and square it. So half of b is 3. 3 squared makes 9. So I'm going to take 9 and add it into both sides. Okay, so on the left-hand side now, I'm going to factor this. If you need to write target product, target sum, you are more than welcome to do that. Target product is 9, target sum is 6. Okay, two numbers that multiply to 9 but add to 6 is going to be 3. But you really don't have to. You can shortcut it. Okay, because the way this is going to factor, because I made it a perfect square trinomial by putting in that 9, it will factor to half of b. Okay, b was 6, so this is half of b, and the whole thing is squared. Okay, so from here we go to here. So x plus 3 squared. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 plus 3 is 6. Target product, target sum. Okay, and then on the right-hand side, we're going to go ahead and add those together. 27 plus 9 makes 36. Okay, so now I have a square on the left-hand side and a number on the right-hand side. We can use the square root property. So we get x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus 6. Okay, x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus 6 because the square root of 36 is 6. And since I introduced the square root, I have to include that plus or minus. Subtract the 3 over. Okay, these are numbers I can add and subtract, so go ahead and do the split. So we've got x is equal to negative 3 plus 6, which is 3. X is equal to negative 3 minus 6, which is negative 9. There's my two answers. Okay, so let's look at another one of those. Same sort of thing for b. Check first, is there a 1 in front of x squared? Here we do. Okay, we'll look at one in a second that doesn't. Okay, second part is to get variables alone on one side. So here my variables are already on one side, but this 11 is in my way because it's not a perfect square. Okay, it does not make a perfect square trinomial, so we're going to move it out of our way. We're going to leave x squared plus 2x plus blank 11 plus blank. Okay, leaving my spot so I can complete the square again. You don't have to write blanks in there. I just do it because it helps me to remember to write it to add it to both sides. Okay, so we are going to fill that blank with half of b squared. Okay, half of b, 2 over 2 is 1. 1 squared is just 1. So we add 1 to both sides. Okay, take this here and factor it. Again, you can write down target product, target sum if you want. That's perfectly fine. Okay, so half of b is how it factors. We get x plus, okay, and it's plus because this one's plus. Half of b is 1. Okay, you have to watch that there. It won't always be a plus. This one can sometimes be plus, sometimes minus. It depends on what your b value is. If your b is plus, this is plus. If your b is minus, this is minus. Okay, so keep that in mind. So x plus 1 squared, which is equal to 11 plus 1 is 12. Square root both sides. X plus 1 is equal to plus or minus. 12 breaks into 2 square root of 3. Okay, subtract the 1 over. Negative 1 plus or minus 2 square root 3. Okay, now here I can't really add negative 1 and 2 root 3 because of that root 3 on there makes them unlike radicals. So that's your answer. Just leave it alone. Okay, so C is just a bit different. Okay, because now I've got that number out in front, and I can't do anything as long as that number is out in front. Okay, completing the square only works if that number is a 1. So the very first thing I'm going to do is divide each piece by 2. Okay, so this gives me x squared, which is equal to 7/2 x plus 2. Okay, so now I need my variables on one side, that's step 2, so we're going to subtract this whole thing over to the other side. So I've got x squared minus 7/2 x, okay, plus blank equals 2 plus blank. Okay, so now I need to take half of b. You can use your calculator to help you with this, or, okay, half of b squared. Half of b, if I take half of a half, I get a fourth, so half of 7/2 is 7/4. Okay, or just flip and multiply. Okay, dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. So I get negative 7 over 2 times 1 over 2, which is negative 7 over 4. Okay, so that's still squared, though. I haven't squared it yet. That was just the 7/2 over 2 makes 7/4. That squared, 7 squared is 49. 4 squared is 16. Negative times negative makes a positive, so 49/16 is what we add in. Again, you can use your calculator to help you do all of that. Okay, so we've got 49/16. Now I have to factor this. Okay, but with the shortcut, it's really easy. I've got x, this is minus, so this is minus. Half of 7/2, we already said was 7/4. Okay, half of negative 7/2 makes a negative 7/4. So that's what I have right there. Okay, half of 7/2, negative 7/2 is negative 7/4. That's where this comes from. Okay, we just took half of b, and that goes there. So that's equal to, now here, okay, if you're going to do it by hand, you've got to find a common denominator or just use your calculator. 2 plus 49/16, hit that math fraction button. Okay, or if you're going to do it, I'll do it off to the side here. 2, we put it over 1. Okay, we got to get a common denominator. So that gives me 32 over 16 plus 49 over 16, which equals 81 over 16. So we get 81/16. Okay, which is really good because it's going to be nice, pretty numbers. Square root both sides. X minus 7/4. Square root of 81 is 9. Square root of 16 is 4. I introduced the square root, so I need my plus and minus. Okay, add that 7/4 over to both sides. So I got x is equal to 7/4 plus or minus 9/4. Those are real numbers that I can actually add and subtract, so we're going to. 7/4 plus 9/4, 16/4, which equals 4. 7/4 minus 9/4. Don't know why I wrote a 2. 7/4 minus 9/4 is negative 2/4, which reduces to negative 1/2. Okay, so that would be my two answers, 4 and negative 1/2. Okay, one more time. If that was rough, go ahead and just rewind it, watch it again, okay, until you can kind of see the pattern. I'm going to do it again here as well, okay. Another one that's got some fractions in it. So, same thing. I don't have a 1 in front of x squared, so that's got to be my very first step. I'm going to divide everything by 3, okay, including the right-hand side. Everything divides out by 3. X squared minus 3x plus 8/3 equals 0. Okay, I need my variables by themselves, which means this number has to go. Okay, so x squared minus 3x plus blank, negative 8/3 plus blank. Okay, to fill in the blank, we take half of b squared. Okay, b is negative 3. Half of negative 3 squared. Okay, that's going to be a decimal. We don't deal with decimals, so just leave it alone. Okay, 3 squared is 9. 2 squared is 4. Negative times negative makes positive 9/4. Okay, so we get 9/4 is what we add. Is a 9. To complete the square. So now I'm going to factor this thing right here. Okay, this whole thing will factor down to half of b. Okay, half of negative 3 is negative 3/2 squared. And you just leave it like that. You don't have to change it to a decimal, just leave it like that. Half of b is 3/2. Okay, half of b is negative 3, so half of that is negative 3/2 squared equal to, okay, again, you can use your calculator, negative 8/3 plus 9/4. Okay, your calculator will totally do that for you. Just use your parentheses properly, or find a common denominator. Okay, so I'm going to do this up here to the side. 3 and 4 has a common denominator of 12, so times 4 times 3 gives me negative 32/12 plus 27/12. Okay, which is going to give me negative 5/12. Okay, so that equals negative 5/12. Okay, square root both sides. X minus 3/2 is equal to plus or minus. Okay, now 5/12 doesn't really break down much. You could break down the 12 on the bottom, but since it's not going to work out pretty, you don't really have to worry about it. Okay, the negative does have to come out. We never leave a negative under the radical, so we'll just do I root 5/12. If you want to break down the 12 into 2 root 3 on the bottom, that's fine, but you don't really have to, since the top doesn't break down at all and it doesn't reduce at all. Okay, so then from here, all we got to do is move that 3/2 over. X is equal to 3/2 plus or minus I square root 5/12. Okay, nothing else reduces, nothing can be added together, so that's just your answer. Sometimes they will be ugly like that, nothing wrong with that. Okay, so that's completing the square. Watch it as many times as you need to until you can kind of see the pattern going on. Good luck.